It began in silence. No gunfire, no armies, just the sound of a fountain pen scratching across paper, one signature after another. Kaunas, Lithuania. Summer, 1940. Europe was burning, and the borders were closing one by one. Thousands of Jewish families, stripped of home and country, gathered outside a modest consulate building with a red sun on its flag. They weren't soldiers. They were teachers, musicians, mothers holding infants, and they were desperate. Inside, behind the glass window of that consulate, sat a man whose calm eyes concealed a storm, Chiune Sugihara, vice-consul of the Empire of Japan. Every morning, before the sun rose, he'd find them waiting outside the gate, faces pale with hunger, hands clutching papers, passports, letters of plea. He had seen refugees before, but never like this. They had nowhere to go. They were trapped between the advancing Soviet army and the tightening Nazi regime. Japan had ordered him to do nothing. Tokyo's message was clear. Do not issue visas to anyone without proper authorization, but Sugihara couldn't look away. One afternoon, a rabbi was brought into his office. He laid a crumpled map on the table and pointed to Japan. If we can just reach there, he said, we can survive. Sugihara leaned forward. His training, his duty, his loyalty to the empire, all of it pulled against what his heart was whispering. He stared at the papers before him and then at the faces outside his window. He knew that a single stroke of his pen could mean the difference between life and death. That night, he couldn't sleep. He wrote a letter to Tokyo, asking for permission to issue transit visas. Days passed. The answer came, request denied. He wrote again, another denial, and a third time, still no. The official stance was unwavering. Japan must not interfere. Sugihara sat at his desk, staring at the telegram. Then quietly, he made a decision that would change history. He picked up his pen and began to write. For the next month, he barely slept. Every morning at dawn, he sat at that same wooden desk with his wife Yukiko beside him. Together, they filled page after page of handwritten visas, each one a lifeline, each one an act of defiance. His hand began to tremble from exhaustion. Yukiko massaged his fingers, wrapped them in cloth, and poured tea to keep him going. Outside, the crowd never stopped growing. They passed food through the fence, helped translate names, took turns keeping order. Refugees who didn't even know each other became a community, united by one man's pen. Sugihara worked for hours, sometimes writing until midnight. He refused to stop. When Soviet officials ordered the consulate to close, he begged for more time. They gave him 3 days. He used every second. When the building was finally seized, he continued writing in his hotel room. When he boarded the train to leave Lithuania, he wrote from his seat. Eyewitnesses say he threw the last signed visas out of the train window as it began to move, so that the desperate hands reaching from the platform could still grab them. Those visas carried families across Russia, through Japan, and eventually to safety in Shanghai, Palestine, and beyond. Over 6,000 lives were saved, 6,000 stories that would never have existed without that defiant hand. But to Sugihara, there was no glory. He told his wife simply, "They were human beings. They needed help. I just did what was right." Back in Tokyo, word spread of his disobedience. He knew what was coming. He was recalled, stripped of his diplomatic title, and quietly dismissed from government service. He would never serve as a diplomat again. Yet even in disgrace, he never expressed regret. When asked years later why he did it, he said only one sentence: "If I had not done it, I would have disobeyed God." The story of Chiune Sugihara isn't one of rebellion, it's one of conscience. A man caught between duty and compassion, and who, with nothing but ink and courage, chose the latter. As the train rolled east, his hands still ached from the writing. He watched Lithuania disappear behind him, a land scarred by war and courage. And in his pocket, one last blank visa form remained. He didn't sign it. He kept it as a reminder that every choice, no matter how small, carries the weight of a life. When the war ended, the world began to count its dead. But no one came to count the lives saved by a forgotten diplomat in a modest office in Lithuania. Chiune Sugihara returned to Japan in silence. There were no medals, no speeches, just the quiet shame of a man dismissed for breaking orders. Tokyo did not imprison him. They did something colder. They erased him. The government listed him as retired. He was stripped of his rank, his salary, and his future in foreign service. For a man raised in the code of loyalty and obedience, this was a quiet death. He and his wife, Yukiko, began again from nothing. They moved from town to town, taking small jobs, selling light bulbs, translating documents, even working at a train station. Once a former colleague passed him on the street and did not recognize him. Years passed. The memory of Lithuania faded into the noise of reconstruction. Sugihara never spoke of what he had done, not to his neighbors, not even to his children. Then, one afternoon in 1968, a letter arrived. It was from Israel. The man who wrote it had once been a frightened teenager standing outside the Japanese consulate in Kaunas, clutching a transit visa signed Chiune Sugihara. He had survived. He had built a life, a family, a future. And he was writing to ask, "Are you the same Sugihara who saved us?" For the first time in decades, Sugihara's eyes filled with tears. He whispered, "They are alive." That letter began a wave of rediscovery. Word spread among the Jewish communities of Europe and Israel of a Japanese diplomat who had written visas against orders. Soon, survivors began to find him. They called themselves the Sugihara survivors. Thousands of them, doctors, teachers, artists, children of those who once stood outside that consulate gate. They began tracing their lives back to the man who had chosen compassion over command. In 1985, 40 years after his dismissal, Chiune Sugihara received a call from Jerusalem. Israel's Yad Vashem Memorial had chosen to honor him as righteous among the nations, the highest recognition given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save others during the Holocaust. By then, he was an old man, frail and quiet, living in a small Tokyo apartment. He was too ill to travel. His son, Nobuki, went in his place. As the medal was presented, survivors stood holding photographs of the man they called their second father. They cried, they applauded, they spoke his name aloud for the first time in decades. Chiune never sought fame, but in that moment across oceans and time, his act of defiance became immortal. When he died a year later in 1986, few in Japan knew his story. His obituary was small, tucked in the corner of a newspaper. But in Israel, hundreds attended a memorial service. Families lit candles for the man whose pen had given them life. Years later, his former home in Lithuania became a museum. Children visit it now, touching the wooden desk where he once sat. The ink stains remain on the surface, a silent echo of his hand. And today, across the world, more than 100,000 descendants of those refugees live because of him. They are scientists, musicians, parents, and children who carry his legacy not in blood, but in gratitude. When asked how he found the courage to disobey his own government, his answer was always simple. I could not allow them to die. There was no other choice. In an age of orders, he chose empathy. In a time of hatred, he chose humanity. And with nothing but a pen, he reminded the world that one person, one decision, can change the course of history. As the story of Chiune Sugihara fades into history, it leaves behind a question. How many lives could be saved today if more people dared to disobey for what is right?